Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for tuning in today for Cold War Spaces. Today's topic is Under the Table Space, Artistic Expression in a Kommunalka. And our guest is Eugene Yelchin, an award-winning author, painter, and illustrator. He grew up in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and got his start in theater set and costume design. In the early 80s, he left the Soviet Union for the US, where he worked as an editorial illustrator. And after completing a graduate degree at USC, he worked in advertising and then character design in Hollywood. His illustrated picture books and middle grade novels include the 2018 National Book Award finalist, The Assassination of Brangwyn Spurge, co-written with M.T. Anderson. A Tommy DePaula Illustrator Award winner, he also received a Newbery Honor for his novel Breaking Stalin's Nose. His book, The Genius Under the Table, growing up behind the Iron Curtain about his childhood, will be released in October by Candlewick Press. And at the beginning, you saw a selection of pages from the book at the beginning of this program. And the program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Eugene and Joes Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. And after that, we invite you to use the Q&A box to ask questions, and please put them there, not the chat, since that will be where you will be looking. And as we're getting started, feel free to say hi in the chat. We'll use that for any comments or discussion. And say hi, what city you're tuning in from. It's always nice to see where people are from. And we'll be posting the recording of this program on our Vimeo page afterwards and in podcast format on our SoundCloud page. Lastly, I want to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now Joes will get us started with the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna Rose and Eugene. Welcome to Cold War Spaces. Good to have you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.
No, absolutely. So you wrote a really beautiful book about your life, your experiences in a communal apartment in Leningrad from the perspective of a boy. And I would like to start with some basics. What is a communal apartment and where did this concept originate?
Well, it's, what's interesting about communal apartment in the Soviet Union is, in a way, it depends how you look at it. In a way, it's a symbol to me for the entire kind of history of the Soviet Union from the inception to the end of it, because all the kind of Communist Party policies and interpersonal relationship between people culturally and socially played out in that space. It originates weeks after 1917 revolution in Lenin's mind, actually. He wrote a decree, if I'm not mistaken, in which, according to the Marxist doctrine, the private property would be abolished. And so all of the apartments that belong to the bourgeoisie will be resettled. And, it became kind of the cornerstone, really, of Soviet civilization, to the degree that it became also a part of like jokes. For example, and I'll tell this joke, then I'll stop with this because I could go on with this. When Stalin died in 1953, he was moved into Lenin's mausoleum. My book begins with my family's visit to the mausoleum in Moscow, in which mummified body of Vladimir Lenin, who's the founder of the Soviet Union, was laid to rest. And so they moved Stalin in, but then he was there for a short period of time. And then when Nikita Khrushchev, the next one, came to power and was sort of trying to do some anti-Stalinist policies in order to usurp power, really, they moved the body out. And the joke was that now they're resettling Lenin's communal apartment. So it works on many levels.
Right, but I guess you had to share your communal apartment with more other people than Lenin had. Can you tell us with how many family members you lived in one room and how many families were part of this communal apartment?
Right. That apartment was what's called Sadova Street, Garden Street, which is old part of St. Petersburg. Uh, um, there were 5 families technically living in in a 4-bedroom apartment. There was this old lady who survived the siege of Leningrad in that apartment. She lived by herself. Next to her wasn't a room, it was a walk-in closet in which, without windows, in which a family lived, a man and a husband and I think 2 children. I'm not 100% sure, but my brother told me that everyone was afraid of him because they thought he was a criminal or some had a criminal past in some way.
And if you say a walk-in closet, how big or how small was that? Can you give an indication of the size?
Yes. Well, according to the Lenin's decree, originally, and I believe that square meter is about 10 square feet, something like that. So according to Lenin's decree, it was 13 square meters per family. Then it went, under Stalin, it went down significantly to 5.5 square meters, so about 50 or 60 square feet per family. In 1940, I think it became 4 square foot. Our room was maybe, I'm not sure, maybe 6 to 8 square feet. There were 5 of us in it. Next to us was another family. The woman was a kindergarten teacher and her husband worked at the plant, and he stole some stuff from it and built a still in their room. Most of their room was occupied by this still because they were drunks, and they were making sort of booze at home. And then there was, and I write about that guy who lived by himself, and everyone knew that he was, worked for the secret police, but of course nobody would ever say it. So that's about it. The common spaces were 3. It was a hallway, kitchen with a sink, cold water tap, and a little nook in which it had like a toilet.
Right.
There was no bathroom or no shower or no bath.
Yeah.
That was pretty much it.
So that sounds like an absolute lack of privacy. So when there was a need for privacy, say 2 people wanted to make love, how did that look like in a communal apartment?
Well, I don't know how I'm not sure how it looked like. I know what it sounded like. Right. Quietly. Our room was so small, and I describe it in the book, and that's sort of the communal apartment, and that table in the middle of the room is a kind of the heart of the book, really, is a centerpiece of it. When we would all go to sleep, 5 people in a very small room, my father had to kind of move the furniture around and arrange it in such a way that everybody can lie down, which left really no room for me to sleep. Because the table was it was a big dinner round table in the middle of the room. And so I slept on a metal cot that my dad would slide under the table, and that was kind of my space, which I absolutely loved, of course.
Right.
Because speaking of privacy and lack of privacy, that with the tablecloths around was a little tent, and it was quiet at night, and it was safe because my parents and my brother, my grandmother was right there. Right. So I thought it was just the best thing that anybody can ever have.
And we'll get back to that because that was always also the space where your artistic career started, in a sense.
Indeed. Yes.
Yeah, right. But let me ask you, you mentioned the spy in the communal apartment, and also that every communal apartment, or most of them, had their own spy. So there must have been so many of them all around. How were these spies recruited, and what did they gain from it, given the fact that they must have been the most hated person in their communal apartments?
Well, you know, that was part of the function, because the original function of the communal apartment was kind of, it was always a dance between ideology and necessity. And so the ideology would always cover the necessity. So the necessity originally was lack of space. There was not enough space for all the people who were coming to big cities, Leningrad, Moscow, former soldiers, peasants. Just there was big influx of population. So therefore, dividing those apartments and subdividing them, putting little permanent, temporarily rather, walls, created satisfied some part of that, but it was all under the guise of ideology, you know, because the private property was abolished. Under Stalin, it became slightly different. Function was in operation. It was function of control. So as a result, there was enormous amount. The secret service secret police was a huge apparatus with millions of people employed. But the problem is that it's a huge country with millions and millions of people. So the idea was to create sort of the propaganda ideology that there's something, that there are always enemies around, that we're constantly surrounded by the Western countries who want the demise of our way of life. And as a result, people were sort of watching each other because everyone was so freaked out. And in some apartments, yes, they were people who were directly employed by the police and were paid for it, but they were also just eager Soviet citizens who followed the doctrine and were making sure that there's nothing funny is going on.
I understand, yeah.
So people were watching each other, essentially.
Yeah, I get it, yeah. In your book, or reading your book, we get to know quite a lot of private information about you and your family. One interesting point at the beginning of your book is that your father told you about grandfather Lenin. And then you wanted to ask him how it is possible that one man can have so many grandchildren. Right. But you also mentioned, I didn't dare to ask because that would sound unpatriotic. Mm-hmm. That is quite a remark, of course, for a boy. So would you say that generally speaking, the oppression of curiosity among children is something that characterized the Soviet Union in your experience?
I absolutely agree with that statement. Yes, well, it originates, I think, to a degree. It's twofold. On one hand, I think Russian culture in general tends to protect their children. They feel like the less they know, the safer they are. There's even like a folk saying, you know, if you know too much, you'll become too old too soon, or something like that. I can translate it. But also silence was means of self-preservation. One didn't want to say things that could get you or your family in trouble. Parents would not share with their children history of their family in case a child would repeat something that should not be repeated in a classroom or in a courtyard or wherever, and everyone will get in trouble. You know, it's very difficult for me to remember. I remember my mother's voice quite well, but not my father's. And that was a well-known fact that men in communal apartments, some men didn't talk at all in communal spaces.
Right.
So silence and secrecy is very much part of Soviet civilization, yes.
Right. You are from a Jewish family, and you describe some instances in your book of anti-Semitism towards you, but also towards your parents. Can you give us an impression, how was it for a Jewish family in the, say, the 1970s in the Soviet Union when you grew up, being a Jew and being called out? Yeah.
Right. Well, you know, anti-Semitism is in Russia has a kind of medieval roots. It's a very old concept. But after the revolution, it sort of it was illegal actually to say anything anti-Semitic.
Right.
After the war, it's changed significantly because of the Nazi occupation. So anti-Semitism became very prominent, and after the war, as you probably know, 1948, when the anti-Semitic purge began with hundreds of thousands Jews were arrested and exiled and executed. Right. To be a Jew carried kind of a very negative connotation. So as a result, I think that my parents were kind of careful how they positioned themselves. For example, my father had to change his Jewish name to the Russian name in order to, you know, he was in the army, he was a communist for many, many years. And to be a Jew probably wasn't very easy for him. I went to a school with about 1,000 students, and the history teacher and myself were the only Jewish people in the entire school. And I felt it every day. I know that my brother felt it. And then the 70s was kind of a rollback from 1967, from the, you know, the war, Arab-Israeli war, because the Soviets took the Arab part and they were selling arms to them essentially. So anybody who was a Jew was also a Zionist, and Zionist was like a traitor to them. So yeah, we felt it very, very strongly, yes.
But you mentioned in your book that your father was a staunch communist. Didn't he feel the tension between being a communist and living in a country, a communist country that allowed this anti-Semitism? I produced it.
Yeah, I would say that probably will remain a mystery because he never did talk about it. He was a very intelligent person, and I'm sure he saw the difference between what we were told on the radio and on television and what was actually happening, but he would never really voice his opinion on that, not in front of me at least.
No, I see. Throughout the book, you mentioned the dancer, famous ballet dancer, Barishnikov, and we saw a few images also in the book at the start of this program, who was hugely admired by your mother, to say the very least, but he defected in 1974. So what impact did that have on your mother? How did she emotionally cope with his defection?
It's very difficult for not just for her, but I think for everyone. It did come as a surprise. I don't think people expected it because just weeks before Barishnikov was part of this big communist youth congress. You know, if you're very observant, you could tell by looking at photographs that he was not particularly happy to be there. But I don't think even he knew that he was going to defect. So it was a huge surprise. It was very difficult for my mother. My mother worked at the Vaganova Ballet School. And so she knew Barishnikov from the day he arrived from Riga as a young boy to study there. And throughout his life in Leningrad, my brother knew him well. He was in our apartment a bunch of times. So my mother was very, I can't say friendly, but yes, she admired him, but he was, you know, it was a small town essentially. So everybody kind of, in that, you know, world, everybody knew each other. And it was a shock and a huge loss for the country, not for him, because I saw him here, dancing, and it was a good thing for him and for the whole world, really.
Right, right. Can you tell us a little bit about the impact, I would say indirect impact, Barishnikov had on your own life?
Well, right, simply because the concept of artistic talent, at least in my family, was valued hugely as means of survival. My brother is an extraordinarily talented athlete, and so he had eventually sort of more or less decent life there. And my parents my parents really worried about my future, right? Like any parent. Excuse me. And I showed absolutely no talent for athletics, for sports, but I showed some artistic talents. And so I was kind of pushed in the direction. But prior to that, my mother, because of her engagement with the ballet and working at this Vaganova school and at Kirov Ballet Theater, she kind of decided that I should be a dancer. So I had to go through this whole humiliation of, going to the artistic director and doing. I describe all of this in the book. That it's just a total disaster.
It's very funny though, the story. Yeah.
Funny, but I'm glad
Not for you, of course. Yeah.
I'm glad it never happened. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. I want to ask you a little bit more about your father, because it's so interesting when you read the book that he just seems like a split personality. On the one hand, he is this very strict and loyal communist, but then on the other hand, he's a great lover of Russian poetry and also of poetry's spirit of freedom and truth-telling, which he, in his own life, seemed to lack. A very touching episode in your book is that he stands in line the whole night in freezing temperatures to obtain a book by the poet Ossip Mandelstam, which
Right.
actually leads to his death then.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain a little bit about these two spirits in his body, so to speak, or
Well,
how did it work?
yeah, it's weird. The kind of this split personality, as you mentioned, this kind of schizophrenic characteristic of at least intelligentsia was very apparent. On one hand, and I think of the whole kind of system in which you always have to vote with the majority, and you always have to say what is expected, but you are free to think whatever you want. And therefore that was a big concern for the government and for the particularly secret police, to a degree that actually Stalin in mid 40s, I think, kind of announced that, that it's not what you are guilty of, it's what you potentially could be guilty of that makes you a criminal. And that's why so many innocent people perished under that regime. But I think that was widespread. It wasn't just my father. I think it was all grown-ups, for the most, especially intelligentsia. In the 70s, there were few and far between people who really spoke the truth, like Solzhenitsyn, for example, but or Sakharov later. But they had such status that in a way they were safe.
Right.
If you did not have that international status, it was very scary, because they, apart from just criminalizing your opinion, they also decided maybe you were insane and put you in a mental hospital, and that was very brutal for a lot of people who didn't really recover after that.
Right. Do you think that your father maybe secretly dreamt of being a truth-telling poet himself?
Well, he was certainly a lover of poetry and literature, and Russian literature had that. It's 19th century tradition that remained with the classics. Is it's not just telling the truth how things are. It's looking for universal truth.
Right.
What does it mean to be a human being? How are you supposed to treat others? It is truth-telling machinery, you know, the literary machinery. And so there's always that split. And if you want to write a poem, you know, like Brodsky said, the last line is the most important. What is that punchline, so to speak? If it's not true, if it's not sincere, if it doesn't come from your heart, it's not a good poem.
Right.
And yes, when that happened that you mentioned with, it was the first time Osip Mandelstam's book was published in the Soviet Union. He was arrested twice, and he died in a concentration camp, in a transit camp in 1937, I think. And there were 5 really poets in the 20th century. Two women who were of Russian ethnicity, Anna Akhmatova and Marina Tsvetaeva. Akhmatova died a pauper, essentially. I mean, she had nothing. She lived with other people. Tsvetaeva committed suicide during the war. And there were 3 Jewish men who were writing in Russian. Boris Pasternak, of course, who really died because of what they did to him after Dr. Zhivago, which is a horrific campaign, and he died within a year from a heart attack, I think. Mandelstam, who was sent to the camp where he died, and Brodsky, who was essentially exiled from the country. So that's how that country treated its highest form of literature.
Right, right. So in a moment we are going to the Q&A, and please put your questions under the Q&A box where I will read them. But before we go there, let me ask you one final question. The title of your book is The Genius Under the Table. So can you tell us a little bit what happened under the table at night? And
right, well, really, it's not, you know, I always feel very uncomfortable with that title simply because, but it's not mine. It's a quote from my father's. So what happened is one night when I was very young, I took my dad's pencil at night. And I still remember the underside of that table. It was just a pine boards, and the carpenter who built it just scribbled some marks, you know, where to cut and how to cut. I had no idea what they were, but they looked very mysterious and interesting to me. And I snuck my dad's pencil under the table one night, and I started kind of doodling on it. And that sort of beginning, as I mentioned earlier, that feeling of safety and peace and surrounded by my family and yet privacy and drawing at the same time, in retrospect, I think, put me on a sort of artistic path. Right.
So you were actually recognized or discovered, so to speak, by your parents, right?
Yeah. And
can you
that's what you said.
That situation, because it's
because as we were discussing earlier, the sort of idea how to survive, how to succeed, forget it, how to survive in that country was so present and urgent that artistic talent was something to be desired. And when, you know, they find their child who is defacing furniture on one hand, but on the other hand is drawing something that resembles life, that's a huge coup for them. Yeah. Hey, he can be an artist, he can survive. And so that was certainly a cause for celebration, which then kind of set me up, and my mother introduced me to to a great teacher. And so it kind of all began there.
Perfect. And I see we have a question in the Q&A by Leda Schubert. Will there be a follow-up to The Genius Under the Table? Which is a nice question because the book isn't out yet, but it's a great question as well. Will there be a follow-up?
Yes, there's a second book that's in the works right now that deals primarily with immigration, with how I left the Soviet Union and came to the United States. Is that it's 1980, 1981, 82, and 83. It's 3 years, right? When it all happened. Yes, there's a second book. Yes, definitely.
Great. And okay, yeah. I don't know if you already want to give a little bit away about the perspective of the book, or.
Well, I think I think the perspective of the book is I'm older, of course, in it, and it's sort of a tag of war between. It's difficult to leave one's country. I was 27 years old when I left, so, and I didn't speak English, and it was complicated. So it was constantly a tag of war between sort of your roots and your city and, you know, your life there and your friends and your work, and really freedom, for the lack of a better word, because that's something that we certainly lacked. And that tension is at the heart of that book. Yes, right. Of the second book.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, are you in your studio as we watch?
Yes. Yes, I am. Yes, this is the studio. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks amazing.
Yeah, it's not exactly under the table. No, it's a little bit larger.
Yeah. Okay. And then we have a question from Susanna Altman. Were you aware of Ilya Kabakov's Kommunalka works? As he too started as a children's book illustrator, much of his later installation work seems to be informed by the spatial challenges of those shared apartments. Do you relate to this?
Oh, I relate to it very much, but I was not aware of it until they showed up here in the United States. I did not know, because he's from Moscow, and traditionally the sort of the Leningrad artistic circles were very, very different from Moscow artistic circles. Muscovites were much more conceptual and more contemporary and more sort of westernized in a weird way. The Leningrad artist was slightly more toward 19th century and turn of the 20th century. That's where sort of our interests were. So no, I did not know about conceptual art.
But and when you got to know these Kommunalka related works by Kabakov, what was your impression, or what did you think about it?
Oh, I loved it. I love his work. I've never met him, but I've been to those installations, and he does spectacular work. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Could you speak briefly about your art practice and how your upbringing behind the Iron Curtain may have influenced your creative process?
Well, that's a big question. It's certainly influenced what I do now and what I have been doing for the past 30 years here, simply because, you know, what's interesting about growing up in Leningrad or St. Petersburg is the fact that classic Russian literature of 19th century, Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Gogol, Tolstoy, you know, all those people, they tend to use real addresses in their narratives. So, for example, several blocks from where we used to live was the apartment in which Raskolnikov killed those two ladies in Crime and Punishment. And just a couple of years ago, I came across a news item, a Russian news item, in which a reporter went to this apartment where the murder took place in the book and interviewed a family who lives there now. And there was a young woman and a young man, and they had a baby, and the baby's crib was in that space where the murder took place. And so the reporter was asking him if there's anything weird or uncanny going on. And they completely seriously replied to him that no, they don't feel anything so far. So they spoke about it as though it actually happened.
Right, right.
And as a result, you know, that sort of the ratio of boundaries between imagined and the real is very much influences one in one's artistic pursuits. And I think my work is very much based and formulated by that crossing of boundaries. Even you know, even The Genius Under the Table is essentially is nonfiction, is a memoir, but it is written like fiction. It does read like a novel. So there is, where do you say what's real, what's not real? It's very, you can't.
No.
And I'm okay with that.
Sure, sure. Okay, the next question. Hello, greetings from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Thank you for this exciting conversation. Being from the Baltics myself, the notion of the kitchen and the table being a central part of living struck a chord with me. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on Khrushchev's later developments in housing? Families being finally able to have their private kitchens, Khrushchev's later developments in housing. That is to say, families being finally able to have their private kitchens, whether it contributed to dissidency and helped ease the silence and secrecy, as you mentioned before.
Right, I completely agree. The kitchen, well, you know, private apartments were not technically private; they belonged to the government. They were given to you, and people would kill to get one of those. They were Khrushchev's apartments. They were tiny. They were 1-2 bedrooms. The kitchen was very small, very, very small, and yet they became a center of kind of intellectual life. And as a person's mentioning, later dissent, because that's where people felt that they could speak their minds. And that occurred in the 70s and probably at the beginning of the 80s. And in those tiny, tiny spaces, dozens of people would converge for long conversations with practically nothing to eat, you know, but always some to drink and a lot of cigarettes to be smoked. And, you know, yes, they became symbolic in that way. Absolutely, I completely agree with that.
Right, thank you. Grace Worster asked, have you been back to Leningrad?
No.
Okay.
I did not go back to Russia. The last time I was there was 1983, and the way things are playing out there now, I'm not in a big hurry to go back.
Right, okay. Then, and we have a question from Anne Bobrov Hajal. I lived in Leningrad for a year. I'm now an artist with a PhD in Russian history in the late 1970s. As American grad students there, we always felt Leningrad was much more related to Europe and in that sense more modern as compared with Moscow. Could you talk a bit more about why among artists the opposition between Leningrad and Moscow seems to have been important?
Well, I don't know if it's important. It was just a different perception, different of how to make art. You know, St. Petersburg, as probably everyone knows, was built for Peter the Great as kind of the window to Europe. It was a very European city. It was essentially built by Europeans on European blueprints, and it's closer to Amsterdam and to Paris probably than to Moscow, for example, or to Kiev. The sort of the openness to Western tradition it was very from early 17th century and in St. Petersburg, and of course it's, you know, it manifested in the art making. But people who would come from other cities and become like Gogol, for example, who arrived from Ukraine into that city and found it extraordinarily weird and kind of premeditated. Like, it's not a real city that's lived in. It's sort of a designed as a showpiece, which in many ways it was. But that beautiful architecture and the locale with the river through the city, it created a certain feeling in artists. And if you read Joseph Brodsky's poetry, I think nobody written better than he had about the influence of the salty Baltic air and this kind of drizzle and the name of the streets. It's a very mythological city in that respect.
Right. Thank you. Next question is, did your family experience any of the siege of Leningrad?
No, because they were not. They came to Leningrad after, I believe in 46.
I see.
My father was at the war. He was in the army, and my mother with her mother were in Siberia and as refugees during the war, because they came from Dnipropetrovsk, which is a city in Ukraine that was occupied by the Nazis.
Right. Okay, thank you. At this point, we don't have any more questions, and it is almost time, but I really would like to ask you one more question about which I'm very curious. Okay. So you mentioned in your book also the family scrapbook with photographs of your family, where one person was scratched out. Who was this person, and what did you get to know about him?
Right. Well, you know, every family had before computers, right? Every family had a photo album with photographs. Many families that I've visited of my friends or my parents' friends had those albums. Inadvertently, somebody will be cut out or scratched out from group photos. One thing you did, you never asked. I tried to, in our album, there was one person that was missing from those photographs. I did try to kind of investigate while I was there, and really nothing happened. And then later on, I started putting pieces together. My parents would never answer that question. I would never ask my father anyway. I talked to my mother about this and to my brother about this. It was very, very vague. My mother was, her mother, my grandmother, had two marriages. The first, she was married to a Moscow engineer. My mother was born in 1920. Very soon thereafter, they're separated, or so the story goes. Now, at that period in mid-20s, there was a huge purge of engineers who worked for the Tsarist regime before the revolution. And he was one of them. So to say that they were divorced, when he disappeared, there was no photographs, nothing left of him, leads me to believe that he was probably arrested and probably executed, or at least exiled. But it was never, ever mentioned in my family. In the same token as our relatives from Israel visited last year. And for example, I never knew that my great-grandparents on both sides most likely disappeared during the Nazi occupation of Dnipropetrovsk.
Great silence again.
Yes, indeed, indeed.
Yeah. Eugene, I want to thank you very, very much for a fascinating talk. It was great to have you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Hughes. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Appreciate it.
Perfect. So next week, we have another Cold War Spaces interview. My guest is Łukasz Stanek, architectural historian at Manchester University in the United Kingdom. He published a magnificent book, Architecturing Global Socialism, Eastern Europe, West Africa, and the Middle East in the Cold War. And that will be another very interesting talk, I think. So I hope to see you next week and wish you a very happy week.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.